Very excited to be able to have this fireside chat here at the Cove. Very lucky to have Harry Hamlin, a pretty famous Hollywood actor, but also a technology enthusiast and investor in TAE. And of course, Michl Binderbauer, who's CEO of TAE. And Michel's going to kick this off, but I just wanted to say I thought this would be interesting for this group for a few reasons. First of all, this is an interesting mix that you wouldn't normally have in most regions of the country, as in we have Hollywood involved, we have big science involved, we have a $1,000 check that really started what is a massive big science project that Michl will explain. And as we've heard in other talks today, Dave and John, this is a company that currently has a $3 billion valuation. They've raised $700 million. In my understanding, there has not been a down round since Harry wrote that check.
That's right.
So if there's anything we can learn from that, it'd be very helpful. But I also think this is a very exciting story. And I'll just say that I've been an angel investor since 2000, and I've literally screened over 1,000 deals. And I have not seen a more effective pitcher than a nuclear physicist in Michl. He is incredible, and you'll see how infectious his energy is and really why he has pushed and pulled this project through from the very beginning. So Michl, why don't we start off
with thank you. No, I don't know if I deserve to be here, but with that introduction, I appreciate it, Bill. So I wanted to share a little bit about our past before we go into this to give you sort of a flavor of where we came from, and this is a perfect location to do it, given that this really originated out of the campus. Some now almost 30 years ago. We started this actually in 1989. Harry and I became friends, about sometime mid-90s maybe, right?
I think mid-90s, I think early 90s.
Early 90s perhaps even. And then 20 years as a real company. So in fact, in 1998, when we began, we had a thing we called the sewer pipe. It was actually a university project scale. We drew it up on a napkin over lunch and then built it in a few weeks with a few students. And that migrated over the last 2 decades into ever more sophisticated national lab scale machines. In fact, we're operating now, what you see there highlighted in yellow, we call it Norman, because Norman Rostocker, my PhD mentor and one of the top people in the field, a faculty here in the physics department, deserves all the credit really. He's the brainchild behind literally everything we've been doing. And this machine is getting us now to the proof of science stage. And so the complexity of this is now way actually beyond national lab scale. In fact, this is the largest, most modern fusion machine in the country. And as Richard said earlier, it's fully privately funded. No government support, no down round. This was all done on private equity placements through the years and scaling this up. And what we're really going to be in the next couple of years is actually the ability to actually make net energy. And that's going to happen in a machine we call Copernicus. And we're in the process of funding and putting that project together right now. We're working actually for the first time with the UE in some form of relationship where they're going to contribute some in-kind. And this will be a sort of public-private partnership to pull that off, and then it goes to commercialization. So the notion that you hear fusion is another 20 years away, 30 years away, 50 years away, it's not true. We're talking commercialization coming in the next 5 years for this technology. And more importantly, when you look at the evolution of this, there's a ton of technology that enables that. It's just like when NASA went to the moon and developed lots of stuff. In order to do these kinds of sophisticated devices, there's just an incredible spectrum of technology and sophistication. And as we matured our main goals, we had to mature the speed technology to support that. And that led ultimately now to a terrific portfolio of opportunity that we're in fact commercializing today. And so in fact, this last year is the first year for us where we're, instead of just only bringing investor dollars in, we're actually harvesting the fruits of some of that labor. There's multiple spin-offs that we're pursuing. The $7 trillion opportunity in fusion, of course, is center and foremost and is the driver. But there's a life science unit, which we spun off last year, which raised $40 million last year for an A round. It's doing very well in a very novel cancer treatment. We're actually also talking to the campus deploying one of these machines. These are actually going out now. The first one is going to go in China next year and start clinically treating people with diffuse cancers with a technology that comes out of our beam accelerators. TA Mobility is something I'm working on this year. This is a company that's going to really revolutionize the electric drivetrain. Think taking the current batteries and motors and all the components, but put smarter software and smarter electronics together derived out of our power supply developments. And that's going to enhance the drive range of cars by about 30%, give you another 40% of power and performance headroom. and ultimately will allow us to build more cheaper and more compact electric cars and help the evolution in that sector, which of course is massive. And then there's evident work we're doing in beams generically because it supports all these things. So TAE today migrated from just fusion-centric to fusion being the focus, but a broader portfolio of things. And with that comes the opportunity for a sort of staged set of what I would call return on investment or influx of capital other than through the usual past of ours in terms of real revenue. Quickly, just one word about the ascent to this. Fusion is a very tough subject, right? For good, people have spent 50, 60 years pursuing it. It requires two things, a lot of high temperature and time to confine the material. Think of a sort of a ball of oozy jello, and you want to hold this together with rubber bands in the middle of space. And this will ooze away, right? And so how do you do that? There are lots of different people with lots of different ideas. Ours is uniquely different, derivative of Norm's incredible brain and intellect. And it drove us up into a very different space with the goal now to ultimately get to something that we call hydrogen boron fuel, which is in the very top right there. And that requires 3 billion degrees. So today we're continuously operating the machines that you saw somewhere in the neighborhood of 30 million, and we're going to 50 million by early next year. The first terrestrially burnable fuel that we can harvest for net energy is around 100 million degrees. It's called DT. It's what the world is pursuing. With the next machine, Copernicus, we're going to access that state. And then by the late 20s, we're going to be at hydrogen boron. And each of these gives us opportunities to license technology to those in the world who want to pursue these. And ultimately, think of TE as a technology provider. We're not an equipment provider. We're not a GE. We're not going to build power plants. Those are low-margin things. It's the interesting part is the software, the smarts behind it, the technology base. And this is where the company is focused. And you can do this with a few hundred people as opposed to tens of thousands of people. And you don't need a big balance sheet to do that either. So this is where we're focused, and this is our ascent. And over the next 10 years, I think this is going to be an inflection point for humanity. And it is certainly an incredibly exciting time, not only doing the fusion, but to spin out these other opportunities. And so what we wanted to share with you guys today was a little bit of that journey and the kind of organic evolution to get to this stage of existence. So with that, I think I've said a little bit too much perhaps about science, but I think it's a good backdrop. And with that, maybe we'll have a conversation about how we actually got here over the years.
Before you start that conversation, though, just give them some overview. You fire the machine multiple times a day, and how much data you collect every time you fire the machine. And you are heating the plasma greater than the center of the sun in this building. And an aside, think about that. They have plasma in their building hotter than the center of the sun. And the issue they had with the city and permits was the color of what, your nitrogen tank, or what tank was it?
Yeah, that's right, actually.
Yeah.
You learn a lot about
you
siting,
can heat up the plasma.
planning.
The color of this tank here is, they're in an industrial area. I just think that's
I'm amazed you remember that, Richard, but that's very true. So on one of our earlier machines, so we're building this sci-fi project, right? The worldwide sourcing, best and brightest around the world trying to help. And then we got stuck with the planning commission in Lake Forest that didn't like a 6,000-gallon liquid nitrogen tank outside, because we're in an area where it's not very industrial. It's not supposed to be. And so everything comes on time, is delivered. We're ready to go. The investors, everybody's fired up. And then comes the notch of the planning commission saying, no, we can't deploy the final piece to cool all this gear, this tank. And so it was a negotiation. It went from what I thought a simple process to the bizarre. Turns out there's a law in California in the building code, you have to be 3 times the height of the tank, or the largest dimension, away with the nearest wall. That puts it beyond the footprint of the perimeter of our plot of land. So it was like, well, we can't build this kind of thing. And says, okay, you can't put a building around it. All right. Put trees around it. And said, look, we have liquid nitrogen tanks. Everybody's seen the Terminator movie, right? When the nitrogen dumps out in the street. These kind of tanker trucks, they come sometimes twice a day. How can we have that there when there are all these trees around? How do you keep all this stuff clean, right? So it was a long song and dance in the end. Yes, it settled on the paint color. Said, okay, if you paint it in with the rest of the building, it sort of blends, we'll pass it. So we learned a lesson there, and we had to run for about 6 months on auxiliary temperature control systems on a project that otherwise was flawlessly executed. But sometimes it comes to the details, and you learn a lot doing these things. Yes.
So talk about how much data you collect, and then let's start with talking about how Harry got involved with this.
Actually, I should rather say Harry should tell me how I got involved with it from the company side. But we'll do that. Just a quick word on the data, right? So there's currently about 8,000 physics channels coming off. We're controlling about 80,000 things on that machine. So think aircraft carrier style control system, very cascaded, controls all these things perfectly. And then the data that comes out, It's on the order of 10 gigabytes per shot. There's about 60 shots a day that we fire, or experiments. And the biggest problem is really processing that intelligently, right? Gathering it is one thing, but then to actually do something with it that is readable by human beings, there's a massive amount of behind-the-scenes back processing, and we have now gotten that down to an art. Google is a helper on this. We use a lot of AI and machine learning, and we can actually post-process these experiments now at that level in about 3-4 minutes. And so then you can have a very high shot pace, and in fact, we're using computers to decide what the next shot even is. So we've taken it out of the hands of the operator, and we've turned it into a machine learning experience where computers never forget anything, right? They know the entire history of every shot we ever took. They have a sense of where we want to go. They can connect this intimately with the 8,000 data lines that just came out of the experiment we ran. And then what it also does, if you tell it you can go from one point to the other point, anything in between, and it will also explore near the ends. So human, we tend to like to be in the center. You don't like to go where it's edgy or where, so you could fall off a cliff or the machine could have a defect. And this is the wonderful thing, the holistic exploration of space and finding new opportunities there. And we've done remarkably well with that, actually, with Google as a partner. 2 years ago on the older machine, we found a new operating regime where we could actually get much hotter plasmas than we had ever anticipated. So that goes for all the graduate education and the mindset. Sometimes that combination of humans plus the sort of untiring computer systems behind it and extracting the best of that exponentiates actually our ability. And so I wanted to just throw as a final in there, there's always this notion we're going to get run over by AI one day. And I think we're a perfect example that says humans have enough creativity and intelligence that computers don't. So when we put the two together, they can really excel. And so I think there's a good notion there that we're not going to get overtaken by those systems any day soon, not on the creative side anyway. So Harry, maybe you want to chime in on how do we end up here?
Well, clearly I'm not a rocket scientist, and I'm also not a nuclear physicist. But I must say that the smartest thing I've ever done in my life was to recommend that we hire this man to be our chief technical officer. At the beginning, that's what your title was. Now
that's
you're
right.
CEO, run the whole deal. But I first became aware of aneutronic fusion, or clean fusion, in 1980, curiously at a cocktail party in Rome, when a nuclear physicist came up to me and he said he didn't speak German or Italian, and he heard me speaking English, so could he talk to me? And he talked my ear off about this new idea he had for a new way to make electricity that was clean and pollution-free and ubiquitous. The fuel was ubiquitous, and you could run these power plants for years, and there'd be no global climate change. And I thought it was way too good to be true. I thought the guy was out of his mind, in fact. But he asked for my address in LA. He sent me a lot of material over the next 3 or 4 years. By the late 80s, he asked me to join a company that he had started called Advanced Physics Corporation, which he was forming here in Irvine in collaboration with Norman Rostocker. Rostocker is the man we call Norman because of Norman Rostocker, who was an extraordinary physicist. He asked me to be on his board of directors, and when I went to the first meeting, he introduced me to my fellow board members. One was Murray Gell-Mann, who had just won the Nobel Prize for discovering the quark. The other was Glenn Seaborg, who had won the Nobel Prize for discovering plutonium. I'm wearing his pin for Seaborgium right here, which is element 106. And then he introduced me to Buzz Aldrin. He said, this guy walked on the moon. So more and more of the board members were more and more famous. And I said, who is this guy? And what has he got? Obviously, somebody believes in this technology. In any case, over the next, I'd say, 6 or 7 years, I became sort of the spokesperson for that company and for aneutronic fusion. I went to Washington and I testified before Congress, and I went on the Hill and tried to get some traction among the politicians, and I went to big banks and I tried to sell this idea to banks. And I'm not a rocket scientist and I'm not a nuclear physicist, so who is going to listen to me? It was a losing battle from the beginning. But then, in late 90s, I guess, Norman Rostocker and a bunch of us who were on an advisory committee decided that we would start our own company, that we wouldn't wait for some other entity to come along that we could hitch our wagon to, that we would actually get together and start our own company amongst very few of us who were on this board. It was a bold, and a lot of people would say ridiculous idea, that we would start a company that would try to change the world and get us off of fossil fuels and into an entirely new regime for creating electricity. And so, for some reason, we decided to do it. And it was a wink and a prayer that we went on. And you saw the first check that I wrote from my wife, Lisa Rennes, and our household account, which then we were able to raise $10,000, I think, in the first couple of weeks of the company. We had Frank Wessel wrote a business plan in 2 weeks. So we started the company on April the 11th, 1998.
That's right.
We had a business plan ready by April the 1st. We had our first board meeting late April, and all of a sudden, Lady Luck descended on us. And we had Michl as a potential CTO. Without Michl, without him having come aboard, none of what you saw on that screen ever would have happened. I would say that I would have to say that the people that you have hired, the way you have run the company, the way you have orchestrated this symphony of science has been absolutely extraordinary. So for angel investors, for people who are trying to think about how did this all happen, it comes down to the people. It comes down to if you get the right people involved, if you find the right person to run the ship, to steer the ship, that's when you're going to have success. And Michl, I have to, my hat's off to you for doing an unbelievable job over the last 20 years.
I appreciate that. I would add, I was invited this last summer here to give one of the commencement speeches for the physical sciences, and I was thinking what to tell the young students, and one of the things that crossed my mind, which is so intrinsically related to what we've done here, is purpose, right? There is a grand purpose behind what we're trying to do that attracted people out from far left, and as you said, you're an actor, right? People from very different walks of life than nuclear physics. And our board today is stacked with some of the brightest investors, some of the biggest minds in the world. Ernie Moniz, the retired energy secretary in Obama, is on our board. Jeff Immelt from GE, John Mack from Morgan Stanley. The name goes on, the list goes on. And all these guys came in at the right moment, at the right time, with a particular key to unlock a door that was critical for us to get unlocked. These kinds of things, as you said, they obviously have to succeed in making science fiction happen from a scientific perspective. But more often than none, it's these other circumferential things. It's the human element, which is the biggest. In fact, if I ever get asked what is the proudest achievement, I always think it's bringing people together. To do something on this scale, we need hundreds of super bright minds. Those people typically don't want to work together. So to get them to band up as a team to actually deliver something like that is hugely difficult to do, and usually the biggest impact point from a risk perspective, right? And then bringing the periphery of the people together that open the doors with the NRC, with fundraising, with whatever have you. And I think it's the great purpose behind it that's greater than any one of us, that somewhere connects all of us and creates that sort of, that fertile soil around which you can build something like this. And you look at the incremental chance for failure, or I should say success, it's basically close to 0 for each one of 100 steps. You multiply these together, right? The number is definitely 0. Yet we're here. And I think it's because of that purpose behind it and that mission that starts to develop. And as we get traction, of course, today it's easier to convince people that this isn't just science fiction or we're all kind of a bit wacky in the garage. There is more to it now, and that makes it easier. But even now, it's on a bigger scale, and it's still that same sort of dynamic, I think, that plays out. I think you said it very well.
The chances of this succeeding to this level were absolutely 0 when we started out. I mean, what I knew when we started the company was that if we hadn't started the company, then the chances of this ever seeing the light of day would have been less than 0. All I knew was that if we started our own company, the chances would be slightly greater than 0. Only slightly greater than 0. But it turned out to be enough.
It was.
So I want to jump in there because, first of all, Harry's underselling himself, and that his father was a rocket scientist.
That's right.
So he comes from deep technology background. I threw out the Hollywood actor because we all have biases what that means, but there's a lot more depth there. There's also incredible depth from a leadership point of view from Michl. So from a leadership framing, Michl is a transformative leader. In other words, he creates a vision that allows people to be part of something much bigger than themselves. So not only is he incredible at pitching, I mean, you can feel his energy, right? But it's also how he's led. And I'm sure that Harry's network, et cetera, in the beginning certainly played a big role. So these two together were quite the duo. And my perception is there's never a such thing as a complete CEO. You build a CEO by the people around them, and in the beginning, having these two leading the charge gave it a little better percentage chance. I want to ask one more question, but also want to make the point, I don't know if it was clear, and if boron 11 is still the element, is that this uses a non-radioactive material, but it's cheap and plentiful. It solves all the problems. There's no radioactive output, there's no radioactive on the inside, so this really solves from a environment point of view and a cost point of view the incredible solution. So what I want to do before we get into questions, because I'm sensitive to time here, this had plenty of near-death experiences like most startups did. So maybe the two of you can talk about a couple of those along the way.
You want to take a shot first?
Well, I just remember there was one time, and I'm not exactly sure when it was. We were flying to New York for a board meeting in New York, and we were on fumes. Basically, the company was on fumes, but we had some irons in the fire. I was flying in from LA. I think you were coming from Long Beach, maybe, and we somehow intersected in the airport as we were going down the baggage claim. I saw Michael. He was coming here. He was coming, and as we were going down the elevator, I was saying, man, we're kind of in trouble. This is kind of, and Michael looking at his phone, right, and he's going, wait a minute. It came through.
That's
and we
right.
got a $50 million, as we were going down the escalator, he said, we just got $50 million.
That's right.
I think it was welcome.
It was welcome, yeah.
From
Yes.
and it was, so as we were going down the escalator, he hadn't gotten that call, we might have been going into Armageddon, but instead we got the dough. It was amazing.
Yes, there are obviously many stories like that. One I remember, you mentioned Rome earlier. We were in Rome, we were trying to get the Italian electric company, it was about 2005, to invest. And they invited us over after quite a song and dance, and it was at that point to build our first fully integrated machine. So the company had, at that point, about 12 million total in aggregated investments, and we wanted to make a jump to about a $50 million project. So, quadrupling, if you will, the needed investment, and of course against a fairly unknown risk profile for many and what that meant for us to scale there. And so we're in Rome trying to convince these guys with the help of an Italian guy who's incredibly well connected. And it was, to me, the quintessential Italian deal. I'm European, so I grew up in that kind of cultural environment to some degree. But we're at their headquarters, waiting for half an hour for the guy to show up. He finally comes in, says, I'm sorry I'm late, but I have 5 minutes for you. And the answer is no. And so there's this guy with him who had worked with us on preparing the deal for the executive team. And so he walks out with the senior guy, and they're in the hallway, and I understand a little Italian. He starts getting at him and says, you can't do this to these guys. They just flew across the Atlantic to come here. You can't just, you rudely show up late, and you can't tell them no. And he says, yes, I can, and if you don't quit right away, you're out of a job too, right? So this guy comes back in, is very apologetic. The other guy who was with me, we walk out. It had started pouring buckets. So, we're out there now, no umbrella, center of Rome, feeling completely, already disheveled. Now comes the water. It was a perfect storm, and we had another day to kill, and I said, let's go to the Vatican and look around. And so in our we began bootstrapping a little cafe, what we're going to do next. The team at home was waiting. The university, in fact, was our creditor at that point. We had a lot of people working on the university ledger. We didn't have any HR at that point, so we used grants to the university to support the funding. And, and it was exactly one of those things. Our Italian guy who we called said, don't worry, I will call the finance minister and I'll get this thing fixed. And so we, with mixed feelings, board the plane back to LA. We get out, and it was exactly like that, the same way. Out of the jetway, I turn the phone on, and there's a text message from Marco Risi, our Italian guy, and he says, the deal is back on. They're going to vote on it at the annual board meeting in 10 days. And then sure enough, at 10 days of the board meeting, unanimous consent, they felt so embarrassed for having done this to us, they actually wrote a check. And that was a huge bootstrap, a big check too for that point. It was the biggest check we've ever received. And it was one of those moments. I mean, and in fact, I still believe, and Marco and I have talked about this many times, if it wouldn't have been for the flogging we got at their headquarters that day and the rude behavior, they probably would have said, it was business-wise a crazy decision to give this outfit in California in the garage that kind of money from an operator of power plants that isn't looking for something 20, 30 years down the road that's high risk. But sometimes you need those kinds of confluences of luck and things to carry you through. So there's a lot of those war stories.
So one other question before we open this up, and actually before I do that, this doesn't happen, right? An entrepreneur like this, who has an incredible schedule, we're very lucky to have him here today. He's traveling, I think, for the most of the next 30, 45 days. Doesn't happen without the support of their spouse. This is Michl's better 9/10 right here. So I just ran an applause for her.
And I do have to say, she's very forgiving with our 2 little kids to let me go literally on disappearance acts for a month at a time and showing up for a weekend here or there. So yeah, it does take the home front support that to do this, definitely.
So talk about how the university helped and hurt in the beginning process. So this deal was done by our tech transfer office a long time ago, well before Applied Innovation was stood up about 4 years ago. And often the relationship with the university is very challenging to get IP out. But why don't you talk a little bit about how that progressed?
I think I might be able to take
Go
that
for
one,
it.
too,
Sure.
Because we first began working on getting the license 1997, I think we were talking about it with them. There were 2 other people who wanted the license, the 2 people that we interviewed in Orlando. We had a big meeting in Orlando, Florida. It was organized by Dave Shetter, who was the tech transfer. He was the entire tech transfer department, one guy, back in 1998. And he organized this conference in Orlando, Florida, and we interviewed these 2 guys who had applied for the license, and it turned out that they were not eligible. We had done due diligence on them, and they were actually bad guys who had been disbarred and whatever. But Dave Shetter was like a dog with a bone. He knew that we had something, and it was very hard for him to convince the university that we weren't just a couple of goofballs in a garage at the time, because we had nothing to show for it. We had no experiment that was ongoing. We had this grand idea that Norman had, and we all respected Norman. And we also had Glenn Seaborg. Dr. Seaborg was a huge promoter of the idea of forming a company and getting the license. But I have to say that Dave Shetter, who passed away last year, but he was extraordinarily helpful in giving us the license. Here we were. We had no assets whatsoever. $1,000. That's all we had to begin with. And yet he walked us through the process of getting the license, step by step by step. So my hat is totally off to the way the university handled that. It was you had more negotiations with him after we started it, but maybe you can go on with that, how he helped with that.
Yeah, no, I think you said it very well. It came down to a few individuals, the key individuals who, just as us, were visionary on this and said, if we don't do this collectively together, this is not going to happen, and the world won't get this chance. And the university here, in particular, the Irvine campus, had terrific leadership, both in tech transfer and in the people in physical sciences. The dean was terrific, and it was for the strength of a few of those individuals that we're here. As I said earlier, I was describing this thing with Enel, right? In the early days, we couldn't afford it. We felt it was a very inefficient way of spending money to have an HR department and hire these people in. In fact, most of us were consultants to the project for years. And the few people who were really full-time, if you will, as employees were actually university employees, and we began on a lab here. In the first few years were up until that lab needed to be torn down and put another building up, was on campus. And so we wrote, sponsored research agreement checks to the university to do this. And they stood up for years in helping when sometimes our checks were a bit late. They still kept the payroll running. They allowed us to eventually rent our first off-campus space, which was, at first a modest space, but eventually a 65,000 square foot building, which we didn't have the balance sheet to support. No landlord would have agreed, in good conscience, to give somebody like us, this sort of scale rental. So it was the university, in fact, the Regents, that then underwrote the lease. For many, many years they did. And I think if it wouldn't have been for that, putting that level of skin in the game and at risk, and having this visionary leadership here, which frankly, and I've seen lots of universities, we do a lot of work with universities across the country, and I have to say Irvine is really unique. I don't know what it is. It's, the University of California is a very big bureaucracy, but there's something here that is uniquely different, and I think it's incarnated now even more so with what Richard is building here. There is a spirit here that's unique, that is visionary, and that's willing sometimes to take a risk when the gut tells you you should. And that's exactly what happened in this project. And I could go on for an hour telling a lot of detailed nuts and bolts things that each in their own right, if we hadn't done it the way with the support we got, we wouldn't be here. And the university deserves huge credit, huge credit.
So UC Irvine has been pretty entrepreneurial from yes. the very beginning. And Michl's on our board at Applied Innovation because, not to take away anything that you two did, but I think we were very lucky that the university worked with you to have it be successful in the beginning, or have it stay alive in the beginning. And we want to ensure that this kind of opportunity not only is allowed to grow out of the university, but we're supporting it and connecting the financing for it, et cetera. They're way past our ability now.
But you know, there's still some great symbiotic relationships. For instance, so we've sponsored 8 PhD students that we ultimately hired. We've sponsored countless undergraduates and master's students. We're doing continuously work on all sorts of areas, now with the more expanded portfolio covering from the medical side to chemistry, to physics, to engineering. And so there is a vibrant interactivity that in fact is a big fabric component of success. These technologies are vast. There's no way for a private shop, even with 1,000 people, to cover everything adequately. So you have to have these partnerships. And so I think that there's this continuous reliance, symbiotic, mutual respect reliance on each other that is wonderful. And this is why I love coming here and helping, and why, you know, Harry and I are both on the advisory council to the Dean in Physical Sciences, because this is so vitally important. And I think if you look at the future of any of these larger technologies, public-private partnerships, academic, private industry partnerships, they're critical. And the work as we go into the frontier of technologies becomes more and more interdisciplinary. So the vast nature of resources and intellect you have to pool, and expertise you have to pool from in all these frontier projects is going to require these kinds of relationships. And this is why I salute what Richard does here, because he creates the ecosystem that really builds these opportunities, and they will come.
So you can tell how infectious he is, right? And so, and I was alluding to the financing side that we can't help you with, and we certainly want to continue the partnership in other ways. So I want to open this up to Q&A. So who would like to ask a question? Here we go.
Sometime in the 80s, there was this cold fusion to do in Utah, and it looked like it was pretty much bogus kind of technology and would have set the whole notion back a lot. So how did you actually just go right back to the very beginnings of getting people to say this isn't another fraud that's being committed by somebody?
That's a very good question, and one we certainly struggle and still do.
Yeah,
the whole field has, you know, this sort of sour aftertaste.
Two issues with it. One is the fusion aspect of it, because Pons and Fleischmann, to whom you're referring, they did get a lot of attention, and it turned out that what they were doing was not necessarily above board. That's one element, fusion. The other is nuclear. And so the word nuclear comes with a lot of baggage. And there are a lot of nuclear kinds of projects that don't involve radioactivity. The fact is that most people don't know that. And in this particular project does not involve using radioactive fuel, and won't in the end in any case. So for me, at the very beginning, trying to explain, number one, fusion, we're not cold fusion. And by the way, I went to Washington and I met with a senator in Washington who's no longer a senator, but I saw him for years when he was on the Hill. And I would see him every couple of years, and I explained this to him in depth when I first met him. Every time I went back to Washington, he said, "How's the cold fusion project going?" You know? So I have found, as I have tried to promote this, that those two things are the biggest hurdles, and I think we found a way to get through it. Michael, we have a different vernacular that we use from time to time. That Michael.
Yeah, we do, but I would add two things to this. I mean, number one, yes, this is a big handicap. What we've done, we've responded in two ways. First of all, we were very private. We were under the radar in stealth mode up until about 2015. And we did this deliberately for the fact that this field is overhyped. I mean, the solution is certainly necessary, but you know, we've tried for a long time, and when these sort of spikes come where somebody says something outrageous, people try to run with it, and it gets dramatized and exponentiated. We didn't want that. So we were very, very quiet. Our first coming out party, so to speak, even in the science community, wasn't until 2010 in the arcane journals, scientific journals. 2015, we really came out because we actually are able, with 2015, we had the first ability to actually hold plasma at will in any configuration we wanted to dial in with the computers, and would stay there. And this is a big deal. You can't build a reactor without having control over the hot ball. It was at a conference sponsored actually by the university. Norman had passed away in 2014, Christmas Day. And this was his memorial symposium that the university and us co-sponsored in 2015 in the summer. And we, by a fortuitous confluence, we achieved this data set in June of that year. And this conference was August. I think it was late August. And so we actually announced that breakthrough there. Science magazine had a writer in the audience. They wrote about it. And then it just cascaded. The New York Times wrote about it. We're on the front page of Time magazine. It was an incredible, beyond humbling experience, to be honest. But it was done at that point actually in a very measured way. We had worked with everybody, and our PR team, and David Ewing is here in the back, deserves a lot of credit for making sure that the message wasn't overhyped. We didn't tell people tomorrow we're going to build a reactor. I'm telling you now we're 5 years away because this is built on scientific fact. But this was now 5 years ago, and it wasn't at that point there, and we said we're still about a decade away. So that was important. The other thing is we put a science panel together of some of the brightest minds in the field in 2006. And they come twice a year, and they do basically a PhD exam on the company. It's really a thesis defense. Our guys have to prepare for about a month. We come out, we have to defend the data, to defend the next steps, the vision, the step forward, and everything gets scrutinized, and they write a report to the investors and to the board. And so if you don't succeed there, there's no other check coming, and we know that, and so we take these very seriously. And they do two things then, right? They keep a sanity check and a lid on. They bring the outside validation in. They open it up so that somebody on the outside who wants to invest has an independent third party. I should have added these people have no compensation whatsoever other than we cover their time spent and the travel expenses. So they have the independent sort of voice. And this was very, very critical. And that's always kept us not just honestly within the walls from drinking our own Kool-Aid, but it provided that sort of echoing and sounding board to the outside. And I think these are very important things. If you look at what Pons and Fleischmann did, they did exactly none of those. They went straight out. They overhyped what they were doing. They had no scientific checks done or validation before they went out with the news. They should have had another team come in with a different set of eyes and detectors. We do that. And I think when you build it on that level, yes, it goes perhaps slower, but you build credibility. And as it increments up, it gets to the point where the momentum now is really there and it's foundational.
So I'll just say that it's rare that a practice from academia is actually helpful in the entrepreneurship world. But in this case, the PhD process actually, and this independent group, because you had a lot of skepticism by Nobel Prize winners and others in that in the very beginning. So I saw a hand over here.
Can you disclose the financial commitment that the university made to your company? And can you also talk a little bit about the support that you got from the president and or the board of trustees, or was it at that level of decision?
So I actually shamefully have to admit I couldn't give you an aggregate number because it kept coming in different increments, right? But I would certainly say that if you look at a lease, for instance, that was a multi-million-dollar exposure. Now, we paid for it, of course, ultimately, but what if we wouldn't have paid for it? The board of trustees and the regents would have had to cover the bill, right? So they actually took this somewhere on the internal balance sheet and said, we're willing to punt because we are a co-believer in the potential of this stuff. So, and then of course it waned again because we paid it back, and then, something else came up. But it was incremental. I mean, even if you look back at the very early days, we had to get patents filed, right? And we didn't have, as Harry said, we had a $1,000 check from Harry and a few other friends and family, and it was maybe $10,000. But we had $50,000 in legal bills. So the university for years would cover the patent costs that we would reimburse, but it was constantly running totals. And for this, we're worldwide coverage. We have today there's over 800 patents on this. So the portfolio is large and the cost is high to maintain it. And for the first decade or so, it was literally handled straight out of what is now part of Richard's office here. And they were creditors in that sense, that they allowed us to extend, and then we would eventually pay it back. So I don't know if a final total number, but it's certainly millions of dollars up and down at various points.
So let me try to do one more. I saw a hand over here.
So the first question is whether utility scale generation is part of the vision here. And then B, if so, do you have a sense of what the per kilowatt hour cost will be? And then part C is, who are the other potential licensees?
Good questions. So let me try to address these. So first of all, I guess I didn't get to that. Richard alluded a little bit. The company was really built, the whole reason even I joined as a graduate student was that fusion is mainly a game of academic research today. And it's driven by the lowest hanging physics fruit that dictates where you go. This unfortunately doesn't necessarily connect with an endpoint of economics and viability in the utility space, right? And so this is the big fundamental disconnect that's today defecting the field. And Norman understood this deeply and said, and this was so refreshing and why I joined it, he said, we have to subordinate whatever we do to the end game. We need to look at that first and reverse engineer a program that caters to the end goal. What is the end goal? It has to be competitive, economic, viable electricity generation with technologies that exist, that are maintainable by a utility, et cetera, right? Seems pretty simple, but if you look at what the world is doing and spending tens of billions of dollars, it's actually not doing that. So that's the first thing. So we looked at the end in mind, and so cost was always a very big deal. We looked at this, we said, yes, we want, to your first question, we want utility scale electricity to come out of this. Cost factor has to be competitive with current technologies. If it isn't, we might not as well bother. And that's, of course, a fact of economic reality. And then finally, how do you get to that, right? And then you realize PB11 is the only answer to these questions. It's ubiquitous and plentiful, doesn't require breeding, there's no radioactivity, there's no deconstructing half of a power plant every year, which you'd have to do with the other fusion fuel cycles. And finally, the cost point, as we understand it today, will be for the first plants, and the cost, they're learning curves, right? As you start to industrialize something, so we have a lot of access to the big companies in the world that built these big pieces of equipment. So we've studied this carefully. So our first cost points are going to be about 8 cents a kilowatt hour. And if you look at this, there's two kind of metrics that define this. One is the sort of what we call LCOE, or the levelized cost of electricity. This is sort of the wholesale price that you pay for power generation. The other one is to put the capacity in place in the first place, right? So it's what we call the overnight cost, the hotel cost, so build the plant. Those are typically measured in thousands of dollars per kilowatt. And I can tell you, if you look today, the range on a gas plant is like probably $2,000 per kilowatt. And that goes up to about $7,000 to $9,000 for nuclear. The French nuclear plants tend to be built to a higher safety standard than most in the world, so they may even $10,000 today. And so we said we have to be competitive with all this, right? And so our price point is about $4,300 per kilowatt. So it's very competitive. It's not as competitive as gas is in the US, but the US is unique too. If you go to Europe, gas is more expensive, et cetera, right? So it's very regional. So if you look on average globally, we're very competitive, literally from the first few plants. And that price should come down somewhat more. So we have these current curves. And I wouldn't say we'll ever become the cheap to meter. That's not the goal. The goal of the company also is not necessarily to give it away. I mean, we're going to price it so that we compete fairly in the market. But if we can make a good margin, or those that we license it to we will do that. But I think what it really will do, if you go to the end game, it'll be competitive. It will be able to run high power centric loads. It can, if you think of the future of the world, right? It'll be mega cities, tens of millions of people. Think today in the developing world where most of this power use will come from. This is a huge problem that is underestimated because people look at it and say, well, the population increase. Right? So if you look at the next 25 years, there's about 20 to 30% more people living on the planet. We're at 7 billion, roughly, we'll be at 9 billion. The electricity demand will go up from about 4.5 terawatts to about 9 terawatts. It will double. And that's coming from most of the inequality today of quality of life, right? That will have to be, what these people will drive up. And guess how they're going to do it? They're going to burn dung, they're going to burn fossil fuels, whatever, to get to a level of industrial capability. And this is the biggest problem because it becomes a global pollution problem, right? And so the question is, how do you intercept that? And a technology like this can do that. Lagos, Nigeria, it's a completely out of control, chaotic city with tens of millions of people, right? How do you power a place like that? Solar cells can't do that. Wind can't do that. You need a high power density solution. And the only one that's carbon free today is fission. And fission won't do it because it's not competitive financially and because nobody is willing to put up with the dangers it precedes. This is the solution in the end, right? And so once you bring it to that and you say the price point's there and I can deliver this now and I can make it holistically working where I have ubiquitous fuel, no carbon emissions, no particulate emissions, no radioactivity, that's the holy grail. That's where we started and that's where we're going to go, and this is the price point behind it. So I think it's a great proposition.
So in answer to A, it is industrial, and as far as I know, each power plant is going to be between 250 and 300 megawatt. Is that not?
Yeah, we're looking at around 350, 400, but it's the scale of a good-sized gas plant.
So that's the scale of it.
So we're out of time. I'm sorry we went a little past, but I'd like you to help me thank them for coming out today and having this discussion. Thank you, Harry, and thank you, Michael.